Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Griffin Society tour of the Griffins Canberra. I hope I'll be able to explain qualities of Canberra that were embedded in the original plan. One of the great places that has been constructed more or less where Griffin intended is indeed the Australian National University, and so we're leaving the edge of the ANU and heading into Civic, as Griffin termed it. The centre of Canberra today is called City, officially. The Griffin idea was that this part of Canberra would have the town hall on the top of what is now City Hill, where the city flag is flying above those pine trees. And this part of the city would be more the commercial business side, with the GPO, perhaps lawyers' offices. It had the Mint and the support for more civic functions. It wasn't intended to be the principal retail centre of the city. It was his capacity to sort of seize the salient points of this largely treeless limestone plains of the Molonglo, and then to make them the organising points of the principal avenues, which is so strong. But now Constitution Avenue, this was really to be the great street of the city, principally with the retail activities and so on extending along this street, and with the great central park extending from here down to the northern shore of the lake, with the cultural institutions located within it. The great National Theatre and the National Opera, which we are still waiting for, the art galleries, the museums of science and technology, all set within a very generous city park, on the principle, again, of the American cities, where the grand parks of the 19th century, such as Central Park in New York City or Grant Park in Chicago, had also been the site of cultural institutions. We will now be turning into Anzac Parade, as we know it, or the Prospect Parkway, as Griffin termed this great alignment on the land axis, extending from the conical form of Mount Ainslie across to Capitol Hill and then beyond to the Alps in the far distant south. Griffin's idea for this space was completely different from what we see today. It was to be like the mall in Central Park, essentially a tree-lined plaisance or promenade, which would be a funnel of activity for the citizens to walk along. Just in from here, the city railway would be in a cutting and run underneath the avenue. There'd be a station at this location, and the streetcars would run along Constitution Avenue. To the left and right of us in the suburbs today of Reid and Campbell, we would have had low-rise but high-density courtyard apartments. It would have been a very intense urban population living here. This space would be like their park. There would be reasons for people to be on the avenue. Where the War Memorial is located is a site that Griffin showed in the plan as a casino. He did not mean, I don't believe, a gambling casino, but a casino is a place of outdoor resort. It's a place of outdoor orchestra performances and sophisticated dining and so forth. Everything did very much changed when the First World War changed Australian life. The War Memorial has made a decisive influence on the mood and the symbolism of central Canberra. Now, as we head into the bush, it makes us think about why Canberra is here in the first place. As we know, it comes out of the Federation debates of the 90s, which was really a negative idea, to deny advantage to Sydney or Melbourne. There are plenty of precedents, of course, for creating an artificial capital between two powerful rivals, and indeed Washington, D.C. is a good example. The very first meeting of the Federal Parliament, a very radical decision was made that the land for the Federal Territory would be purchased by the government and be held for the Australian people forever. It is absolutely astonishing to think that Marion Mahoney was able to draw the plan from this position and to get it absolutely right. It is a most incredible leap of imagination. Again, it comes from the Griffins' command of the terrain information that was given to them in the competition conditions. But this is only in outline what the Griffins intended. One way to think our way into the Griffin plan is to face, first of all, the technical challenges inherent in this selection of this site. The first challenge was that the Molonglo River flooded, and it had a very broad floodplain. So the Griffin solution was to flood the floodplain, to impound the river and to create an artificial lake system. But what Griffin planned was a dam or a causeway, and to carry the railway on an earthen dam, and also to have the main road on that same dam. Griffin was going to build his dam to impound another lake at a higher level further to the east. The plan was that the water of the upper lake could fluctuate with our droughts and control the formal basin in the symbolic centre of the city, but also the dam would carry the main north-south route through the city to come down Northbourne Avenue, across the base of the triangle, diagonally across to the southeast and then on to Queanbeyan. The fact that that's never been built, either as a railway or as a road, is the number one reason why people get lost in Canberra. When you see the site and you see Mount Ainslie, which is a conical, of volcanic origin, when you see that conical form, making that the centerpiece of all vistas and compositions is so obvious. Once again, the Griffins were truly inspired. We have the land access taken from Mount Ainslie through the top of Capitol Hill, and Griffin imagined way down in the south, in the southern Alps, that it also hit Mount Bimbury, which is the highest mountain in the ACT. But in fact, we can't quite see that. And it's not quite as good as Marion's drawing, where it looks like Mount Fuji. But nevertheless, the idea of the larger axis extending right into the continent is tremendous. The other idea is the water axis taken at right angles from Black Mountain through the middle of the lake, and it extends across to the east coast and the Pacific Ocean. What's really important is the triangle that Griffin put within the axes. And there he found this small hill we now know as City Hill. He could see that he could get the beginnings of a triangle by extending that alignment. The railway was to be constructed in a cutting, mostly through the city, so the roads would go over the top of it. However, when he got close to the apex of his triangle, the railway was tunnelled through the outlying hills of Mount Pleasant, and this main station was built on top of the tunnel. And so there would be this spectacular arrival into the city, going underground, coming up, seeing the city from a grand plaza at this location. What's happening here is that he's thinking somewhat like an engineer. He's able to build his earthen dam with the cut and fill of the excavation of the cutting and the tunnel, you see. Well, of course, the brilliant solution. This was really intended to be the market centre, that is the retail centre of the city. But of course, to make the most valuable lots available for development required all this infrastructure to be built. Meanwhile, there was all this flat land over here where they could put the shops. And so after Griffin left, they decided to do that. The shopping centre started on Northbourne Avenue. Now, it was a terrible mistake. They were starting retail on this hexagon. They had 6 sides to choose from, and they chose the wrong side. They really should have chosen the alignment on Constitution Avenue with the aim that the city would grow along the municipal axis. To Griffin, the triangle was all important, and the development of the city on the northern side was all important, so that the everyday life of the city would grow between these 2 points, between the market centre, the retail centre, and the civic centre, and we'd have a sort of continuous zone of commercial and retail activity along Constitution Avenue, with higher density houses in behind here. Then the great park on the northern side of the lake with the cultural institutions, so that the base of the triangle is the people, and the convergence of the avenues is the expression of the will of the people. And so the government group sits across there on a stage, and Griffin describes this whole thing in theatrical terms as a great theatre where we're looking at the government on stage. We could perhaps say that the dilemma of Canberra as a 20th century city was that it was constructed in the motor age, when the motor car was the dominant means of transportation. If perhaps it could have got underway more promptly around about 1913, and they had built at least the streetcar system or the tramway system that Griffin intended, the dominance of the motor car may not have been so great. But of course the railway never happened. I should have mentioned, of course, the railway was to have suburban stops on it, as well as being the mainline connection to Sydney and Melbourne. But of course, when the real construction boom in Canberra happened after World War II, it was very much the era of the Holden car. So the planning of the NCDC days was predicated on this. Stretching away north and south of us are the satellite towns built around the original Griffin plan. Unfortunately, for all of the, in many ways, sophistication and technical brilliance of what the NCDC did, it did lead to an incredibly dispersed, low-density motorcar city. And so changing that back to a city with a level of intensity and low-rise, high density in the centre is going to be a very major challenge of the 21st century. What we're getting now, instead of the building subordinate to landscape, the number one Griffin idea, we're getting dominant buildings in a big way, in Civic itself and now on the waterfront. Griffin had big ideas about planting, and they had to be tempered a little bit by practical horticultural knowledge. But the fundamental Griffin idea was to have horizontal buildings. And in every article, every speech he gave on Canberra, he always mentioned the idea of the horizontal massing of buildings. He deliberately argued against the American skyscraper of Chicago, where he came from. He says there was no reason to have buildings standing on end, as in the American city, that here we can have a horizontal city embedded in the urban forest. Here we can see the High Court, and it is in some ways a noble building, but it raises this question of should the buildings of Canberra be horizontal or vertical? And I think it proves that verticality doesn't work within this larger landscape. Griffin really intended to have an intensity at street level, but within the larger landscape, the canopy of trees and the scale of the valley and the nature of the hills would have it sitting so beautifully within that larger landscape. In some ways, we must acknowledge that the passage of time, the different generations with their different visions, the sort of almost ad hoc way in which things have happened when the political moment made it possible, gives it a very human dimension, shall we say. The problem is to give it human scale and human interest beyond the monumental presence of isolated elements. And then on our left is the West Basin, which is the subject of this current proposal to extend the city to the lake and to actually fill in part of the lake and create more real estate development, sort of almost Florida style, by selling land that's underwater at the moment, and extending the sort of development we're seeing in Civic right down to the lake foreshore and around City Hill. So that will make a very, very big change to the symbolic centre of the city. Well, here we are at the end of our tour. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's given you a little insight into the Griffin ideas for our city.